Take a good look. This is Australia, this is Canada, this is the UK. For decades, the Indian migrant was held up as the model minority, highly educated, hardworking, successful, but something has shifted. All around the world, the mood is turning sour. From being the model, Indians are increasingly becoming the target. So what happened? How did the world get here? Is this just old-fashioned racism in a new bottle, or is there something more complex going on? And most importantly, how everyone future-proof themselves against this rising tide of resentment. Stick around, because we're about to unpack the uncomfortable truths that nobody wants to talk about. Alright, let's get one thing straight. The current backlash isn't happening in a vacuum. India now has the world's largest diaspora, with over 18.5 million people of Indian origin living overseas as of 2024. They are the largest migrant group in Canada, the second largest in the US and Australia, and a massive presence in the UK. When a host country sees a sudden, massive influx from any single place, the locals tend to get a bit twitchy. It's a historical pattern. It's not about being Indian, it's about being the next cab off the rank. Here in Australia after World War II, we had the populate or perish scheme. We threw the doors open to Brits but also to huge numbers of Greeks and Italians. And were they welcomed with open arms and a cold beer? Not always. They were called wogs, told they were taking jobs and accused of not fitting in. Go back further to the gold rush in the 1850s. When Chinese miners started showing up in large numbers, the reaction was violent. Riots, special taxes, and eventually the White Australia policy, which was basically a 70-year-long national project to keep Australia as British as a lukewarm cup of tea. It's the same story everywhere. In the UK, it was the Eastern European Jews in the early 1900s, accused of overcrowding London's East End. Then it was the Windrush generation from the Caribbean, recruited to rebuild the country but met with signs saying, "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish." In the US, it was the Irish, the Italians, the Chinese. Each group had their turn in the barrel when their numbers spiked. The point is, when a large, visible group arrives quickly, it triggers a predictable immune response from a portion of the host society. It's not about the specific ethnicity, it's about the pace and scale of the change. Right now, it just happens to be India's turn. Now for a bit of a paradox. One of the biggest drivers of resentment is actually the success of Indian migrants. The data is undeniable. Indian migrants are, on average, staggeringly successful. In Australia, they are nearly 3 times as likely as the general population to hold a bachelor's degree or higher. In the US, their median household income is over $166,000, more than double the national average. In the UK, they account for roughly 6% of the GDP despite being less than 3% of the population. They are hardworking, famously frugal, and laser-focused on accumulating wealth and providing a better future for their kids. And in a booming economy, this is celebrated as the ultimate immigrant success story. But when the locals are getting absolutely hammered by a cost of living crisis, that success story starts to sound a bit different. When you can't afford a house because prices are insane, and you see a migrant family buying their second investment property, it's easy for resentment to fester. The narrative quickly becomes, they're taking all the jobs, they're buying all the houses. It's a classic scapegoat mechanism. The anger over complex issues like corporate greed and government policy failure gets channeled towards a visible, successful minority group. It's not logical, but it's a powerful emotional response to economic pain. Let's talk culture. India is an ancient, incredibly diverse civilization with deep-rooted customs. And let's be honest, some of these customs can seem a bit odd to the Western world. Things like personal space, the volume of a conversation, approaches to hygiene, the intricate web of family obligations, or even just the art of haggling over a second-hand lawnmower on Facebook Marketplace. These aren't right or wrong, they're just different. But when these cultural differences play out in a society that isn't familiar with them, they can be misinterpreted. A frugal mindset can be seen as being a tight arse. A strong family network can be perceived as clannish or unwilling to integrate. This isn't necessarily racism, it's a cultural friction that comes from 2 very different worlds colliding without a user manual. This lack of integration is a real problem. In the UK, studies have shown that when communities live in parallel societies without meaningful interaction, trust breaks down. It creates a sense of us and them, where stereotypes are never challenged by real human connection. Okay, now for the part of the conversation that makes everyone squirm. We need to talk about misconduct. Let's be crystal clear. There is zero scientific link between race and a lack of values. But there is a well-documented link between poverty, desperation, and a tendency to bend the rules. India, for all its economic growth, is a country of staggering inequality. Many migrants, especially students, arrive in the West under immense financial pressure, having taken out huge loans. And desperation can lead to some pretty dodgy behavior. We're talking about things like wage theft, where businesses exploit their own countrymen, the rise of visa factories, where education is just a flimsy excuse to get work rights, the abuse of government support systems, or the endless soul-destroying scam calls that, let's be honest, are overwhelmingly linked to India. These things are real. Denying them is pointless. But framing them as an Indian problem is wrong. It's a poverty problem. People who are struggling to survive are more likely to cut corners regardless of their passport. And it's crucial to add some perspective here. While these issues cause huge frustration, data from the US and Australia shows that immigrants, including Indians, have lower rates of serious and violent crime than the native-born population. So while some might be trying to pull a roughie on the tax office, they are not the ones creating a threat to public safety. So, where do we go from here? How do we future-proof against this growing divide? This has to be a two-way street. It's about shared responsibility. For India and its diaspora, there's a clear role to play. The Indian government already runs pre-departure orientation training, or PDOT, to prepare workers for life in the Gulf countries. Why not expand and tailor this for the West? A simple course on local etiquette, tax laws, and workplace rights could make a world of difference. Wealthy, established Indian diaspora organizations also need to step up. Instead of just funding cultural festivals, they could create mentorship and support networks to guide new arrivals, teaching them the unwritten rules of their new home. But the host countries have the bigger job. Integration isn't about migrants just fitting in. It's a two-way process of adaptation for both new arrivals and the community. It requires active, funded government programs that connect people, break down stereotypes, and build trust. And that brings us to our question for you. We've talked about what governments and organizations can do, but what about individuals? What is the one piece of advice you would give to a new migrant arriving in your country to help them integrate and build a good life? Let us know in the comments. The best, most constructive answers will get a pin. The story of the Indian diaspora is one of incredible ambition and success. But success has made it a target. The dislike we're seeing is a complex cocktail of legitimate economic anxiety, historical patterns, cultural friction, and the undeniable actions of a minority. To future-proof ourselves, we need to stop the blame game. For host countries, that means looking in the mirror and fixing the systemic policy failures on housing and infrastructure that create the economic pain in the first place. And for Indian migrants, it means understanding the perceptions, taking responsibility where it's due, and actively participating in the social fabric of their new homes. Because in the end, the future isn't about building walls or living in bubbles. It's about building a bigger, more inclusive table where everyone has a seat.